Thank you very much for this nice introduction. Excellencies, distinguished guests, it's a pleasure to be here. And the theme of today, of this presentation, is really about whether we can embrace uncertainties to create opportunities. It might be a little bit contradictory, but that's what I would like to speak about today. When you listen to many of the policymakers around the world, especially, for example, in Davos, Antonio Guterres, he said our world is plagued by a perfect storm or a number of fronts. When you listen to President of the United States, he's very worried about the nuclear crisis. And when you listen to the World Bank, it's about really the economic forecast, how that is really being plagued. So that looks like a very negative picture. You agree? Nevertheless, if you look at business leaders, they're actually very positive about the future and they see opportunities. Nearly 2/3 of the CEOs of a study we did, of CEOs above €1 billion or dollar companies, they said that in fact they were positive about how the global economy would evolve in the 3 to 5 years. So how is that possible? In fact, despite all of the tragic events that are happening, we're also living in a time of accelerating progress. Let me give you some examples. And first of all, let me tell you that I'm, of course, not happy about all these crises happening. But if you look, for example, at the Ukraine crisis, that's, of course, creating very big shocks in terms of energy or supply chains. But it's also creating, for example, in Europe, a lot of action to save energy or to decarbonize and to migrate more quickly. It's also creating many actions about how we ensure that the supply chains are more robust, in fact, right? Let's look at COVID. COVID, of course, was a tragedy with many, many deaths, but it also had some positive impacts. For example, the immense progress of medical technology, especially the vaccinations, and the vaccinations with new RNA type of technologies, it really accelerated enormously. You might remember still that you might be behind the computer at home because you could not go to work. We have calculated that has accelerated digitation by approximately 7 years. Then, you remember still maybe the 2008 financial crisis. That one made that the financial regulation improved a lot to ensure more stability and better regulation. That was all done to ensure, in fact, that this crisis, if it would happen again, governments would be better prepared. And I think that's the case. We have seen in these last crises that at least the governments did the right actions, to ensure that the economy could continue. So, when you are a policymaker, in fact, you are really ambidextrous, You have two hands or two half brains. You need to manage today and you need to build the future. So how do you get that balance right? It's a very complicated one, especially if you have all of these crises coming to you. You have a tendency maybe to be absorbed by managing today, right? So how do we keep that equilibrium, in fact? First of all, I would like to introduce to you, and you probably know, the concept of VUCA that was introduced already in the 80s by the Americans. And they said that, in fact, we are in times of 4 phenomena. Volatility, the fact that there is a high speed of change. Uncertainty, that you cannot predict the future. Complexity, that there are multiple key decision factors. And ambiguity, it means that you don't know exactly how to interpret something. So that concept has already more than 40 years, right? We have the impression that we are living a time of unprecedented uncertainty, volatility. But in fact, in these times, in the 80s, it was, and even in the 60s, 70s, it was already the case. Let me give you some examples. Volatility, for example, energy prices going up, going down. You might remember the times that they even became negative during a spike. Or economic trends, inflation, also economic growth. I mean, it goes up, it goes down. Uncertainty, the war that I just mentioned, but cyber attacks. By the way, cyber attack, I think that that's the next big crisis that will be even bigger than COVID and the wars, in fact, if that happens. Complexity, climate change, really complex, right? If you want to change and align all of the different interests that exist, how do you do that? Or global supply chains, extremely complex. And then ambiguity. Of course, you have heard about ChatGPT, artificial intelligence. How do we combine that with humans? So the augmented humans, that's really like an ambiguity. Will our jobs disappear? Will we not anymore be as intelligent as a machine? Or geopolitics, right? Where do we stand, in fact, with all of these conflicting interests? There's a professor that said, if you have VUCA, you need to treat it with VUCA. Vision, understanding, clarity, and adaptability. I just wanted to highlight, in fact, that behind everything that we live, it's very important that we classify it in the right category. Is it volatility, is it uncertainty, complexity, or ambiguity? But more importantly, there are two tools that I really would advise to you. One that we call strategic insurances. Strategic insurance is how you safeguard the society against unfavorable, high impact, but low probability. I guess that you all have an insurance against fire at your home. You agree? It's not something that you want to see happen. Probability is probably very small. But if it happens, you're better insured, right? And then what we call strategic levers. Strategic levers is, do you have any means in which you can change the future? And that means, what is it that we need to work on so that we can shape the scenarios that look most favorable to us? If you use these two tools, you can handle a lot of the uncertainty, volatility, and probably also of complexity and ambiguity. So let me give you some examples. And I've used old examples to show you how some countries in the past have done it, and then some more recent examples. So you have been hearing about all of these nuclear threats, especially in the context of the war of Ukraine. And just to remember that Switzerland did not choose to develop the nuclear weapon, you know. They did another road. They said, let's take a strategic insurance. In Switzerland, they made nuclear bunkers mandatory for large homes and residential buildings since the 60s. So why did they do it? It's not just to ensure that people forever will live in a bunker. No, it's because in the first days of a nuclear attack, that's when you have the biggest level of radiation. So they took another way. They didn't take the way of the nuclear weapon, they took the way of the nuclear bunker. That's an insurance. It has a cost, of course, like any insurance that you have. We also see on the cybersecurity many policies and many levers that are being used by the US to try to ensure that they are less vulnerable related to cybersecurity. One of the levers they use, of course, because they believe that China might be one of the threats, is to forbid some of the equipment that come from China. I'm not saying that's good or bad, just saying that that's the insurance, in fact, that they try to take. So these are two examples of strategic insurances. Let me give you now some strategic levers. In the 1973, you remember the oil crisis that then happened, At that time, France decided that they wanted to be independent from an energy policy perspective. So they did bet very strongly on nuclear, not nuclear weapons or nuclear bunkers, but on nuclear power production. And they said, for our industry, it's very important that we're independent of the volatility that exists in the energy market. So they reached up to 78% of nuclear power, in fact. Most recently, you might have heard that they had some problems because they thought that now they could maybe go to more sustainable energy. And they started to put less priority on the nuclear, and they nearly had problems in the supply, in fact. So you need to be very careful that you are consistent, in fact, in how you do it. Another strategic lever that's very interesting is the one related to climate change. It's all of the countries together deciding that they want to change the future, right? That they want to ensure that collectively we use the lever of all of the actions that we have to diminish the footprint, in fact, in carbon. And I want to congratulate, by the way, the UAE for hosting the COP28. But it's complex, as you know. Climate is complex, and the levers that you need to use, they're also complex in that context. I just wanted to give you some examples where you see how to use that, in fact. So, what's very important, in fact, in the message is that ambidexterity is also there to remain, in fact. So while we have to manage today, we need to build a future. So managing today is about delivering performance. What does that mean? It's about ensuring that all of the services that the state supplies are performant. It's also about ensuring that in terms of the fiscal policies and how we ensure that the budget matches all of the income, we are indeed managing that in the right way. It's also about being agile and responsive. And I know that in the region there are a lot of programs that are deployed by the government about agility, you know, and having fast response units, for example. So that's very good. I just would like to recommend that you also work on having strategic insurances. Because it's not just about being very agile, reacting, it's about anticipating. Anticipating what if there's a war? What if there is another health crisis? What if we have maybe a crisis linked to cyber? What if, etc. And it's of course better when you're better prepared, you know, in advance, and you have an insurance in place that immediately can tackle that problem. Then of course, it's about building the future with the other hand. It's about implementing long-term vision. Again, I think that in the region, and that's what I like, by the way, a lot about this region, is that you have this ambition, you know, how to deploy a very long-term vision and trying to build the future. It's also about leveraging the opportunities from crisis. If any way we need to go through a crisis, let's make something good out of it. So whenever there is a crisis, use it to ensure that we're really making the next progress. Like the example I give on COVID, when the digitalization, in fact, improved tremendously. So that's the other element that I would like to bring to you. But above all, think about how you can also shape the future with these strategic levers. What is it on which you really need to put a lot of effort to ensure that really the scenario that is most favorable to the societies will happen? And how can we do that together? That's why this conference is so important, because it's about aligning people working together to make strategic levers, and I hope also some strategic insurances. But it's also about delivering both at the same time and within a VUCA context. That's the complexity of leading currently because you need to be ambidextrous, and you need at the same time to be prepared for all the things that VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, brings to you. These times are very complex in terms of leadership, and it requires what we call this ambidextrous governance. So why am I speaking about this? Because we believe that if you deploy the right strategy, you can turn VUCA from a vicious circle where you're firefighting. Because you're firefighting, you're not thinking enough about deploying the right measures for the future. And because you're not deploying the right measures for the future, you're in fact not well prepared to really take the new crises that come. So in some way, you jump from one crisis for the other. And probably you have seen in many countries how governments, they're so proud because they have solved the crisis, right? And so they're really proud about what they have been doing. But they're not seeing sometimes that they're just jumping from one crisis to the other. And we're forgetting sometimes to build, in fact, the future. So what about going more to a virtuous circle, where in fact we build this ambidextrous governance that is better prepared for all of the uncertainty? By doing that, we deploy strategic levers and the strategic insurances that are needed. And by doing that, in fact, we leverage the opportunities from crises. So whenever a crisis comes, you are well prepared, and you even use it as an accelerator. And I've noticed, by the way, that crises, even if, again, I have to tell you that I don't say that I like crises, but they have been very instrumental in the way that they have accelerated change. Because when there is a crisis, everything that, all the comfort zone that you might have, which makes that you don't want to change the equilibriums that exist, suddenly they disappear, in fact. And so use the crises as an accelerator to have that virtuous circle, in fact. So thank you very much for having listened to me. And let's go to this ambidextrous governance to tackle both today, the future, and attack all of the VUCA crises. Thank you.